So Morbius has been one of those films that had its release date changed multiple times, making us wonder if it was ever really going to be released. Well, it has. Me and my boys bought tickets to see it. So was it worth the wait? Dangerously ill with a rare blood disorder, Dr. Morbius attempts a desperate gamble with a risky cure. What at first appears to be a radical success soon reveals itself to be a remedy potentially worse than the disease. Jared Leto stars in this Sony Marvel adaptation of the comic book, along with Matt Smith, Jared Harris, Adria Arjona, and Tyrese Gibson. Now, if you're like me and you haven't read the comics, the basic premise is that we have Michael Morbius, a physician researcher who's afflicted with some rare blood disorder. His body is deteriorating, and he finally is able to create what appears to be a cure. The cure is an injection that contains vampire bat DNA, and because he tries it on himself, Morbius gains some unique powers, and also a massive drawback, which is a thirst for blood. The story starts out with a scene we've seen in the trailer, and then flashes back to give us a bit more detail on Morbius. I like this because it helps to establish how frail he was, even as a kid. And it also introduces us to someone who will become a lifelong friend, who's eventually played by Matt Smith. While the scenes are short, the dynamic is built so that when we see them in the present, their relationship and their interactions make sense and they just don't feel out of place. I think it's pretty obvious early on how their dynamic is going to play out in the rest of the movie, but I didn't mind that too much. And Matt Smith is wonderful in his role. I mean, he gets to create this character that's a bit grandiose and certainly not humble, but also motivated and determined to have success. And he's almost channeling a bit of the Doctor with some of his mannerisms, which I enjoyed. But I do wish that we would have gotten just a bit of insight into that rare disease that Morbius has. Now, I don't need a huge explanation and all the science that goes behind it, but just a quick intro of what his body is doing to make him so frail. Because when the cure is being explained, it has no bearing on anything, and it doesn't give us a clue as to what the actual ailment was. Now, this isn't a breaking point for the movie, but I did find myself questioning many things about the research and the cure when I shouldn't have had to waste any kind of brain power on it. Once Morbius has taken the cure, the CGI transformations that we saw in the trailer, they look anywhere from awesome to kind of passable. And I like the effect that shows the facial and the body transformations. It's not scary, but it certainly is freaky looking. We get to see the nose morph into a more bat-like nose. His eyes take on this eerie white Rorschach-looking pupils, super long sharp nails, and some amazingly razor-like teeth. And the transformations are quick too, so I really would have loved to know just how it happens and how the character feels while it's happening. I mean, think about werewolf movies where it looks utterly painful to transform. I think it'd be the same here, but that doesn't appear to be the case as Morbius swaps back and forth pretty quickly and with ease. Now, when the effects on him look good, they do look good, and the same goes for the rest of the effects that we see throughout the film. There's this trailing, almost spectral effect that Morbius has when he's moving quickly or pretty much really any time that he's in his transformed state. Now, because he's not a ghost or even supernatural in the sense of ghostly, I couldn't tell if that spectral effect was just for our benefit as the audience or if everyone else that saw him jump around the city saw that too. Now, while it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, it did look kind of good. There's the use of slow-mo in this, and it's utilized at really odd times. In one scene, Morbius is fighting someone, and then the slow-mo kicks in when the two are just in midair. I mean, no blows were landed, and no physical harm was being done at that exact moment. So it was a very weird spot to have the action almost come to this standstill so we could focus on the movements that weren't actually happening. There's also use of a form of sonar, or bat radar as the film likes to say, and it had a pretty cool effect as the sound waves pulse through the air and then through the city. Now the rippling wave effect looked good, but half the time I was expecting to see it focus on an item that Morbius was trying to locate, but most of the time we just watched the waves ripple through the sky. Sometimes the camera work was effective in showing us Morbius leaping around off buildings or even sort of flying through the sky. But there were times, especially during fight scenes and including the climax, where just the camera was so close to whatever was going on that it was just a massive blur with zero context of what was being shown. Is that shattered glass that's tumbling around the fighters? I'm not sure. I mean, it could be, or maybe it's part of a building. Heck, it could even be part of the spectral effect shimmering around Morbius. The action is so jumbled and blurry, it really could be anything, which then unfortunately made the scene anticlimactic and ineffective. And I'll talk more about the climax in just a minute. Now, for a movie that is an hour and 44 minutes long, parts of the story feel rushed and then underdeveloped. I mentioned how I liked the dynamic that's established between Morbius and his childhood friend, and that part works. While it still may be a bit shallow, we have an understanding of them and can flow with it. But there's very little emotional punch to everything that's occurring. Morbius has a research partner, and they have some good chemistry, but any relational aspects feel very shallow, despite being told that they've worked together for quite some time. There's also a pursuit of Morbius by some FBI agents, and while they're okay on screen, I just didn't care about them at all, and they felt like almost an afterthought to the narrative. They would just appear after something happened, make some comments that were attempts at humor, and then the scene would change and they'd be gone. This happened multiple times to where I didn't need them in the movie at all because Morbius himself has a conscience and morals that he's battling. That internal struggle with his primal desires that come as a result of the cure makes for a much more interesting story, if it would have chosen to focus on that angle. Now, there's a battle of good versus evil in this story, and I like how Morbius in this is a bit of an anti-hero. He's doing his best to do right, but there's also a massive urge to give in to his new instincts. Okay, so there are parts in this where I swear I heard the Dark Knight score being utilized. There's a moment where Morbius steps into this chamber that's filled with bats, and the score that crescendos made my ears perk up. Like, I've heard this. I know this. Is this Dark Knight? So the climax of the movie. Okay, it was rushed and lacking so much emotional depth, especially given what's occurring in the scene. There is so much subtext to what is going on with the characters in this climax, but because it's rushed, all the emotion is just sucked right out of it, if you'd pardon the pun. There are some really cool moments within the sequence too, but it's just over and done in such a quick fashion that the end is very unsatisfying. And I gotta mention this also. There are a couple of times where the dialogue is trying to be funny, I think, and it just comes across as absolutely cringy. At one point, Morbius says, "I'm getting very hungry, and you wouldn't like me when I'm hungry." I mean, he delivered it with a straight face, so really, kudos to Jared Leto for even uttering that. There's also another line where Morbius says, "I brought this into the world and I can take it out." Now, me and my boys, we laughed out loud at both of these lines, not because they were funny, but because we were so in shock that such terrible and cheesy lines would have been included at all. All right, so overall, Morbius is kind of a mess when it comes to the storytelling and execution. There are elements that I really enjoyed, and I think that Jared Leto and the rest of the cast did well for what they were given. The story chooses odd pacings and focuses, removing emotional depth when it could have enhanced it. The internal struggle that Morbius faces is the most intriguing aspect of the entire film, and I wish the narrative would have cut certain portions out of the storyline to instead put more focus and energy into that internal battle. The special effects are varied in their effectiveness, and the action becomes way too jumbled to be anywhere near decent. I think there is a good story hidden somewhere within this, but this movie couldn't flesh it out in the ample time it had. There are also two mid-credit scenes that really had me scratching my head as to why they were there and then what they mean, especially in light of movies that have already come out that they were kind of being referenced in this. There's no sex or nudity, there's some profanity and some violence. I give Morbius 2 out of 5 couches. Now, sometimes days or weeks even after I've seen something, my score could go up. And in this case, it's not going to go up. I mean, if anything, after I've had days to ponder it, it may just go down. We're just going to have to wait and see. So are you a fan of Morbius in the comics? I'm really curious at how this origin story differs from the comics. I mean, if you haven't read the comics though, and you're like me, and you do happen to see this movie, let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this review, please give it a like. Also, don't forget to share and subscribe. I'm Chris. This is Movies and Munchies. Thanks for couching with me.